All right. Pat, I see we have 54 folks in our room. Are you ready?
I am.
All right. Well, welcome back everyone to day three. This is going to be a really great day. Number one, because we have Pat Killey presenting today on occupancy management, and then I will be leading into the rate setting process, and then Alan will close us out with a kind of a three-part session on storytelling. And so we have a lot that's going to be happening today. So we're really excited that you still have the energy to come back for day three. So with that being said, Pat, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you and let you kind of kick us off for today.
Great. Thank you. Well, good to see everybody again. And today we're going to, that session we're talking about the housing occupancy process. So housing occupancy sounds like it should be pretty straightforward. You have this many beds, you have this many students, put the students in the bed, all done. However, there are a lot of variables that go into the assignment process that can make it a little bit complex and somewhat of a puzzle. I came to the housing area more from a residence life background. I had done residence life and student conduct with a little bit of facilities thrown in for fun, and never had really thought much about the housing assignments and occupancy area because it's a little daunting and, math. So never my favorite subject. But when I was at Georgetown, I had the opportunity to move over to housing and actually ended up really enjoying the housing occupancy part of it. I like the puzzle, the problem solving. I'm a huge Zelda fan, and my favorite part of the Zelda games are all the puzzles. I don't really care if I ever defeat the monsters. I just really like the puzzle parts of the game. And so there's a little bit of that with housing occupancy. Sorry, I don't know what I did here. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So housing occupancy can be sometimes a little bit more art than science, but that develops over time. After a while, you develop kind of a sense of what your numbers are, how things are going to add up at the end. But there's a lot of science, kind of I'm using science in a very loose term, but a lot of science that goes into this. And that's what we're going to focus about today. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have an opportunity to understand some of the basic foundations of occupancy management, identify the factors that go into a comprehensive occupancy management plan, and consider the housing occupancy process in planning and program development. And whether you stay, depending where you are in your career, if you're currently on the operations side, how this will continue to build, and all the considerations that go into your budgeting and your renovation plans and new construction, or if you're say on the education side, knowing that you're planning for education, you're planning and impacts of your facilities and how you fill the beds and what you take offline to create more community space all plays together. And so hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have an opportunity to kind of think about these pieces all blend together. These are some common terms and conditions, or I call them terms and conditions because that's kind of what we usually refer to our contracts as. So I was trying to do a little tongue in cheek here. And I pulled these from the article that I recommended you read. These are some of the more common ones: capacity, occupancy. We're going to spend a little more time on retention, who stays with us year over year, yield, the number of students who actually select housing, who could select housing. So you have 100 applications, how many people actually, get a room at the end of that process? That's your yield. The melt, how many students have you lost from the time they selected to the time of your move in or your census date? Census date, what is your official number, your official occupancy for the year? You probably have one through your university that you report on because that number changes usually daily, your occupancy number. And exemption policy, what is it if you have a requirement? What is it? What are the policies that you have that allow students to opt out of a requirement if you actually have one? So I want to take a minute and have a little, do a little activity. If you're familiar with how to do annotate, if you can annotate the top of your screen, you should be able to, there's a drop-down menu, hit annotate, and there's a text box. If you could take a little time and write in what you think are some impacts on, let me back up on this. I forgot one phase, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me define capacity, then we'll do the activity. So capacity is the maximum number of beds you can fill. This can be impacted by a number of factors, which we'll get into. But to find your capacity number, you usually have to have a baseline, and that baseline can be usually the number of beds that were built for the building, so either built or renovated. And then from there, you start adding or subtracting. You might add because you convert a lounge to a bedroom, or you will subtract because you turn a double into a single. So those types of things. So now is the activity part. If you can find the little pencil and just start writing in some things that could have impact on capacity. Take a little bit of time there. Yep. Okay, so we've got renovations, rooms needed to be offline, down rate, medical accommodations, reasonable accommodation, great. Directives from above, staff living on campus, that could be turned into staff apartments. Isolation space is a big one. Reasonable accommodation, great. Respite space, emergency safe room, construction. Huge unexpected class year, yep. Environmental, maintenance, emergency repair, COVID, facilities holds. And these are all great. Guest spaces, overcapacity, athletes, LLC holds. Perfect, yes, thank you. These are great. So yeah, so you hit a lot of these. Sometimes impacts on capacity, understand your type, what kind of beds do you actually have? Do you have more traditional, do you have suites, do you have apartments, and how are they used? We have at Penn, we have a building that has a lot of apartment space, and there was some odd, maybe not odd, they seem odd now, but different mix of types. We've got one space where it's technically a 4-student apartment, but there's only 3 bedrooms. That means there's 1 double and 2 singles, and that's always awkward. And so do we turn those all into singles so that they're a little more favorable to students, particularly returning students who have some preference in the room selection process? So you're kind of sometimes stuck with the design that you get. And so how do you use that? The community type, where do you allow first-year students to live? Do you allow first-year students to live in suites and apartments if you have them? Do you only have one type of room type, so it doesn't really matter? Do you give preference to upper-class students for more desirable spaces or more, apartments with kitchens, etc.? Do your RA beds, do they count towards your capacity or not? So, we don't count that into our overall capacity. RA capacity is completely different because for us, they're not sellable beds. So they don't really figure into our budget in that way. Living learning communities, how many living learning community beds do you need? Do you set off, if you want a complete, section or floor just for a living learning community, you don't fill it, what impact does that have? So again, these are all things that impact community capacity. We talked about some medical accommodations. Some places have gender breakdown. You have to have a certain number of rooms to meet that breakdown. That can be challenging. We talked, folks mentioned facilities and construction. So are you adding beds? Are you removing beds through a renovation process, or some just offline because they're not usable? We have a whole floor that's kind of ground level and has moisture issues, so we're going into a renovation plan to fix that, but we're not using those rooms anymore because of moisture and mold issues. Now, remember before COVID, mold was the biggest issue we all dealt with. Emergency rooms and capacity adjustments for those really large first-year classes where you may have to have forced triples or temporary rooms, do closed rooms. Yes, bed bugs too, Crystal. And turning doubles to triples or vice versa. So the thing with capacity is it's a little bit fungible. You can play around with it and it can change from year to year. The building that I was just mentioning with the one floor that's offline, I was just in a meeting this morning on the renovation plan, and we're even trying to determine what is our actual capacity for that building, because they were told in the beginning of the design process they could only lose 50 beds, but we never really set what that 50 bed number was at the start. And I will say that always decided before I started here, so I'm not taking that responsibility. The next thing is impacts on occupancy. So what is occupancy? Again, occupancy is the number of students who actually fill your beds. So again, this is the number could fluctuate daily. So if you have the census data I referred to earlier is the date that usually you use as your reporting date to say as of this date we have this many students on campus, and that will continue to decline. Your occupancy will never be higher than probably the last, when you finish your major assignment processes. And then it's usually a decline from there. But what are some things that can impact occupancy? And some things we've already mentioned. Yep, admissions, live-on requirements, COVID, online learning, size of the class. Off-campus housing developments, that's a big one, particularly the last several years. Exemptions, leave of absence, community competition. These are great, excellent. So living learning communities, again, like we've talked about, if you don't fill a community, what does that do? Do you allow the other students who are part of that community to live in that space if you have demand? Residency requirements, 1, 2, 3, 4 year, depending on the institution. Medical accommodations, the need for singles in older buildings where those weren't originally designed when they were putting as many students as they possibly could into space. I think we're a little more conscious in our design now when we build and renovate than folks were even 20 years ago. What is the exemption process? Admissions, it's been mentioned. I worked at a school where every year, there'd be a different admissions number and you never really could nail it down. I worked in another school where housing was budgeted at 103% occupancy because it was important to the bottom line of the institution. So we knew every fall we were going to have tons of students in triples, and we rented a hotel for students for the fall semester. What is student demand, and is there a lot of off-campus competition? That's a big one. As these private developments have gone up all over around universities and colleges, that has been that's become challenging for us, in terms of how we fill our beds. It may not be as desirable as some of the new builds off campus. Contract termination policies. So if you do you let students select housing and then terminate their contract after the process, and for how long? Study abroad, internships, those all play. Leave of absence. Do you have students coming in from exchange programs? I see in here Greek housing, that's a big one. Do we lose students to Greek housing? RA selection, we just finished room selection here, but RA selection is still ongoing, and so we will lose some of our students who selected a room but are going to be hired as an RA. Cost is another one. What is the impact of our rates versus comparative to off campus? Those are all factors that go into making a determination about how you fill your beds, and what the impact, what decision you want to make for your housing policies and rates, et cetera. We'll talk about it a little bit. I know Andy will be talking about later today as well. Yeah, tropical storms, hurricanes. Yeah, there's external factors that we can't always control. That's a great one. So what is the process like, putting the puzzle together, essentially? And so one of the first steps is you want to kind of have an occupancy model. You want to be thinking through how you forecast your occupancy for selection and budgeting. So you want to know how many students you're working to house. And so you really want to put together some sort of model where you can kind of have that handy. And these are usually planned out for, multi-years. 5 is probably good, knowing that will change year over year, but at least it gives you an idea of something to look forward to. I personally use 5 as my reference point for 5 years out, look 5 years back, and that's usually how I like to do things. But that's just something I've developed over time. But you have to think through, how are your beds allotted? Thinking through what we've just talked about with the capacity and the occupancy needs. How does this impact budget forecasting? But what are the tools? How do you work with admissions for developing your projections, knowing what they're intending to bring in, for first year and transfer students, and making sure they let you know. I've been at 2 institutions where they've changed their goals and didn't tell us, and that has an impact. Facility and renovation plans we've mentioned. What will that have? And it's at a short term, like a 1 year kind of thing. You have to take off 200 beds because the building's going offline for 13 months, or are you losing 50 beds in a renovation plan because you're turning bed space into community space? And how does that tie in? What are your yield and melt rates? Again, I use 5 years in my planning. What we don't know is what COVID will do to this. So, my crystal ball is going to be a little bit fuzzy for the next couple of years, I think, because on top of everything else, Penn went from a 1 to a 2 year residency requirement that started with the class that came in this year. So because we didn't have an in-person fall semester, and we had an in-person spring for those who wanted to attend, but it played around with our numbers. It's so some of our second year students don't think they have to live with us because they didn't live with us their first year, and they're happy to living off campus. We are adding some beds, but not enough to make up all the 3rd and 4th year beds. So the 3rd and 4th year students might think there's not enough beds to come on campus, so they're just going to go off campus, not even going to look at us. So it's going to take a couple of years to kind of smooth out the impacts of that new policy on top of the COVID implications. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next couple of years. And I think we're all going to be playing that a little bit. It's really just hard to know what new student behavior will be like as we go forward. What are the programmatic needs and changes that may occur? Are you a residential college campus and you're looking to change some of your requirements? Again, living learning communities that tend to be a big impact. Are there new vision or mission from the university that housing plays a role in that you need to take into account? So those are all things you want to be part of in the decision making, and so that folks are realizing, who are making decisions outside of the housing residence life area, that sometimes that could have an impact on housing occupancy and capacity, that you want to have that be in those conversations so you can build that into your model. Contracts and deposits. Do you require deposits to go through room selection? So, and do you use that as a base to determine, how well you're doing in terms of demand? So these are, again, some of the tools that you would put in place in your modeling. I'm going to go through so this room selection process is the next phase for returning students. There's a lot of factors that you want to put into that as well. What is it that, what are the impacts of, what kind of impact do you want for your upper class student experience to be for your room selection process? The value added for living on campus is a great part, something you want to do in your marketing. So what makes living on campus different from off campus? And that can be an important marketing tool. Do you have the residency requirement comes into play. If you have more than a first year residency requirement, you maybe not have to work as hard to market to fill the remaining beds. Who can participate? Is your housing open to all second, third, and fourth year students? Is it only open to second year students? Who's given preference or priority? How many can participate? Do you set aside beds for highly aided students? Are beds held for other programs only for a certain class year? Do you have to keep in mind for a certain set of donors, kids? Trying to think through you want to kind of just sort of think through all the things that can have an impact on this process. And you want to sometimes, it's always a good idea to hold aside some popular spaces, because you don't know what you're going to be asked for at the minute the minute you close your room selection process. Somebody, you're going to get an email from the president's office saying, hey, this student needs a 4-person suite in your highest, in your newest building, and you already closed room selection. So sometimes you want to identify with some of your more popular spaces and hold a couple of those out. Do you require deposits to go through room selection? That's a decision that we'll talk about a little bit more later. Are there other institutional specific programs or populations you want to house? And then, is it a self-selection versus an administrative process? I work with schools that have done both for returning students. I personally think self-selection for students is more successful, and students can see what's available to them, and they understand the process, and the process is as transparent as it possibly can be. Then are understanding when they don't get the room they thought they were going to get. But when I worked at a school where we did the assignments for them and they got their assignment, they didn't understand why they didn't get, the room they wanted. And, when we ended up switching to a self-selection process. And we were doing EBI, and that was one of the factors that they evaluated. And our satisfaction with room selection actually shot up when we went from administrative assignment to self-selection. And again, in person versus online. Both here and both at Penn and Georgetown, we use online selection, but there was something very charming and fun about the old days of in-person selection. But certainly wouldn't have been able to do that this year. Other impacts: Greek life, RA selection, study abroad, living learning communities, off-campus cycle. How many of you all have off-campus communities that start asking students to sign leases for next year in September? And that's always a little bit of myth breaking you want to do there, but it's a bad cycle to get into, and sometimes you might want to build your process around it. Probably not, but it really depends on your institution and your culture. Again, we keep referring to medical accommodation. Having a good relationship with the folks who make those determinations, and having a really good communication between kind of working together so they understand what the housing selection process looks like, and building your calendars together and working together on that process is really important, because this can be a lot of students. There's obviously a high need. There's also some students who will try to game the system, particularly using medical accommodations. And the more your colleagues who make those decisions understand the process, the better able they are to help direct students in terms of what their actual needs might be. So that's a really good relationship to build if you haven't done that, or if you're looking to get into the assignments area. And then again, the exemption process. If you have a requirement, what is it that you have to what is it you'll let students out of the process for? New student assignments. These tend to be a little more straightforward than room selection for returning students. Again, residency requirement. If you don't have a residency requirement, how hard do you have to market to this population? Do you allow first-year students and transfers to self-select, or are they all administratively assigned? When do you allow applications to open? Do you require, do students, do early admits get, are they able to start applying sooner so that incoming students can know their assignment before they actually commit to the university? What's the prioritization process? Is there any prioritization process? Deposits, early admit, athletes, the VIPs we talked about, alumni, kids, etc. Do you allow roommate matching? A couple of years ago, and I don't know if they're still doing this, so if there's anybody who's aware of it, just let us know in the notes, but I think it was Duke made a big decision to no longer allow first-year students to select their roommates. And those, a lot of outcry. I think I reached out a year later to see how that was going, and they said it went the way they expected it to. Went very well, and the first-year students were actually very satisfied with their experience. They didn't see any increase in room change requests or roommate conflicts or anything like that. So, but currently where I'm at, we allow students to choose their roommate. Well, what are the implications of the decisions like that? I'm going to get to in a minute. So, and then room type allocation, which I mentioned before. What kind of spaces are first-year students allowed to live in? Let's see. So, briefly, several different options for how you manage your system, your housing system. Is the third-party system, such as RMS or StarRes, or one of the others that's out there? Is it homegrown? Is it paper? Is it hybrid? Kind of a mix. Just kind of having an understanding that these exist and they all can do a little bit something different. A homegrown system is going to be very, very specific to your need, which is great. And that works really well. But if the person who built it leaves, then that can be a problem. Or if it's built on an old platform that isn't supported by your IT department anymore, then what happens? Third parties are great in terms of being able to, kind of provide something somewhat out of the box. There's no such thing, but somewhat out of the box. But again, you're then trying to build your needs into what's kind of a blanket, to fit most institutions. So there's pros and cons to all of them. Impacts and considerations. So, what are the academic, divisional, and departmental priorities that go into your housing decision? So, where does housing fit in your organization? Are you a residential campus? And is the residential aspect of the student experience integrated into their academics and student experience? Is it more just we're providing housing as an amenity, and students who want to live with us, it's for convenience, and that's great, and and there's not really as much of an academic tie. So those are all things you want and can take into consideration in terms of what you're doing in your housing area, in terms of making sure that your assigning processes and your priorities as a department or as a unit within a department align across the board. again, not going into too much detail, but this all has an impact on budget. As I mentioned, the one institution I worked at that budget housing at 103 occupancy, housing made up a fair amount of their overall revenue, and so it was really important. So are you budgetarily, are you self-supporting, or auxiliary versus institutional? Does all your money go to the institution? They just give you an allocation back? How are rates set? What do rates look like? Do you have one rate for everything? Do you have multiple rates depending on room type, or unit? Do you charge a higher rate for brand new buildings? That all has an impact on your staffing and your programming and your renovation and construction, etc. So, excuse me. So, these are all things. Budget. Housing occupancy plays in the budget very importantly, and it has an impact on all of those things. And forecasting goes along with the modeling that I mentioned. So I don't want to spend more time on that since we've got a session on budgets. So other implications and considerations. I want to check my time here. I'm running a little over. So policies and practices, and this is kind of an interesting one, and I'm going to include a link. I'll include a link in a little bit. There was an article in Inside Higher Ed yesterday. I don't know if anybody saw it, on really kind of residence hall segregation and how some policies, housing policies or university policies, have an impact on where students choose to live. So rates was an example. Oh, thank you, Marianne. That was the one I was referring to. And rates is an example. So if you're charging students more for your best spaces, who can live there? If you're giving students early admit, students priority in your housing selection, that has impact, knowing that primarily white, wealthy students are more likely to apply early than, say, first generation or students of color, etc. Do you require a deposit? So what are these things can be barriers to entry to your housing process, or to have kind of well integrated housing system, so that all of your residential areas are kind of open to everybody, and kind of students have that opportunity to integrate. We talk a lot about in student affairs, and in particular about the great thing about college, and is that it can be a place where students can interact and meet people from all over the country, all over the world, and from different socioeconomic classes, race, ethnicity. So how does that all play, and can our housing sometimes be a barrier to that? So something it's interesting to start thinking through. Meal plans, not going to go into them, but are they tied to housing, and is it a requirement? And then I think where there's sometimes a tension between residential education and housing and occupancy operations. So housing occupancy and operations and residential education sometimes can have very different, somewhat different missions. And so, we're looking in education, we're having, you want to make sure you have great programming space and lounge space and great educational communities, living learning communities, etc. But is that a cost to the number of beds that you can offer, and what does that do to the bottom line? And so making sure, again, as I mentioned before, being able to have that discussion between being able to have a good discussion between both parts of the department to understand what your needs are and how to find that right connection, so a right decision. Sorry, my dog's distracting me. I'm very sorry. She's very upset right now because I won't let her in the room. Okay, so we're going to do a group activity, and you're going to be broken up into 2 rooms, and take some time and kind of talk through these these discussion points. Identify institutional mission, priorities, and programs that are impacting housing occupancy at your school, and identify key stakeholders and external, internal to the occupancy management process for your school. So, and I think the groups are set for about, I don't know if we can set them for a little less than 10 minutes, but definitely maybe we can go more for 7 or 8 minutes. So, Lori, we're set to go and break people up. Right. We only have a couple minutes left, so I hope that there's some good conversations in your group that you continue to take on, continue on with your home institutions. You know, there's a lot of information there, but happy to, you know, talk to folks outside of this, or certainly what I recommend is if you're not currently doing housing occupancy, talk to your folks that are, and you know, kind of get a sense of what it's like at your institution and the impacts. Any questions or comments before we wrap up? Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and look forward to the rest of the day.